Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining. As requested, I tried to put something together quickly for the coronavirus, COVID-19 to be specific, and as home care owners and operators, some things that we could do and to be cognizant of. I honestly don't have all the answers. There are so many people producing great information between the CDC and departments of health and federal government, state, and local. But I can tell you just purely from a business standpoint how we're dealing with some of these things, and I can do nothing but share our story up to this point and maybe my perspective and mindset if that helps in any way. So if it's okay with you, I prepared a very rudimentary, very quick slide deck and really more to organize my thoughts to help explain some of this. So let's dive right into it. One thing that you should be aware of is Middle Tennessee, really Tennessee as a whole, where we are a statewide provider. We have over 18 locations. We service, nearly 1,000 people through our different service lines. We have about 700 to 800 caregivers that are working for us actively. But on March 2nd and 3rd, over the night hours there, we were actually impacted by 10 tornadoes. And it was unprecedented. It was, one of the largest, the EF3 and EF4 tornadoes went through downtown Nashville and then on to the Cookeville area. We have offices that cover the entire state. Some offices, some areas were less impacted, but our city, our capital city of Nashville was certainly impacted for sure. And as many of you know, at least those of you who have not been living under a rock, you know that we've got this COVID-19 coronavirus that really has accelerated, and we are trying to manage and unprecedented all over the board. But specifically, if you look at the right-hand side of the screen, you see that Davidson County, where the EF3 tornado was, and then Williamson County, where the two counties which are probably the highest cases. Now, this is as of March 14th. Today's recording today is March 16th, so I'm sure it's above that. But we've been heavy hit, and we certainly are getting the impacts of it, and the concern and some of the just community unrest is certainly there. So, one of the things that I want to talk about really is contingency planning, and can't stress it enough that contingency planning is something that's very normal and necessary part of business ownership. You'd be shocked that it's not just natural disasters, but contingency plans come into impact where there's just things that you didn't expect to happen. And, the planning effect of that is you cannot predict when, but we know things will happen to our businesses. You're going to go through power outages for some reason. You may have technology failure. Too many of us know that our wonderful scheduling softwares go down from time to time, and we have to rely on some form of backup. We know that there's caregiver shortages, which, believe it or not, is something that contingency planning, that type of planning would help with that and assist. But it's not always negative. I give you some examples. Contingency planning, one of the models can be what happens if you were to get an influx of cash. Let's say maybe an investor comes in and it's somebody that you wanted to invest in the organization, and then what would you do and how would you spend that money? Maybe you have a lot of outstanding accounts receivables and tied up in court, or something else is going on and all of a sudden it gets paid to you. Some of us know the pains of the Veterans Administration, the VA, and some of the AR backlogs that happen with that every now and again. And you go from a contingency planning of, hey, we're going to have cash shortages, to all of a sudden we have a cash surplus, and how do we react to that? So contingency planning isn't always bad. It's always good. I'll give you another one that happens more often than not. What happens if you were to find an incredible individual from a talent perspective, and you're not ready for that role or position yet? How do you deal with that? How do you make a position? How do you make that happen for your organization? So these are all different types of contingency business planning. The big key difference is proactive planning versus reactive planning. And the point there is, if you can put yourself in a space of being, professional as a business owner, and you can think through what would I do if, versus reactive planning of, okay, now it's happened, and I'm just going to knee-jerk reaction of whatever's going on. One of the things that I can tell you that's been helpful to me a lot is people who are close to me know that I talk about this a lot. I play chess in my mind, not literally the game of chess, but I use that figuratively of saying, I try to play out 3 and 4 different moves. And that's how logically I work, is I think through all the options that I can. I think about things that are ridiculous, and I think of things that make logical sense, and then I try to also find other options that somebody else can present and really play those out in my mind. So let me give you an example. The proactive planning part of me says, well, I personally don't have coronavirus, but the proactive planning of me says, okay, let's just assume I will. I will have it next week or a month from now or whenever. That what will be my next steps? That's proactive planning. Reactive planning would be a model of saying, I won't have it, I don't have it now, oh well, doesn't matter, and then all of a sudden next week I get it, and I panic, right? And I'm not prepared, I haven't even discussed it with people, haven't thought it through. That can be very dangerous. But as we all know, and kind of the thing that many of you are saying is, hey, well, that sounds great, it's too late. I didn't do any of this contingency planning, and I thought you were going to give some words of wisdom, or at least your experience, and now we're just all being reactive anyway. And I would say it's not too late. It's never too late from a planning perspective, and I don't think it's fair or a good idea to continue down this model of thinking that you don't have options at this time, which is just not true. So let's keep rolling here. The 5 effective steps, 5 steps to an effective contingency plan. I do want you to know that if you were to make a contingency plan, I would say for next level, right? So it is not too late to start planning on things like, well, what happens if there's a mandatory shutdown? What if there's a mandatory lockdown? What if there's a mandatory, some other issue? What if we go through extreme caregiver shortages, not just the ones we've had, but even more than that? Contingency planning is not too late. I bet you could sit there and spend an hour with yourself and your team today and really develop some of this. I highly recommend it. But the 5 steps really go like this. It's identify and prioritize your resources. So you need to be looking at who are my employees, what are what exactly are their roles, where is our IT system, and what roles does it play? As far as our facilities are concerned, what are their capabilities? Can we lock down a building? Can we, do we have enough environmental protections from each other where that would make sense? Physical assets, do we have spare laptops? If there was shipping concerns and we needed to replace, any kind of hardware or tools and resources, gloves, drug screens, so on, are we prepared for some of that? So then the second would be to really pinpoint the key risks. So we started talking about that is, the only way you can pinpoint key risks is by really involving your entire team. You've got to get to a point where your team leaders can give you a holistic picture. And what that basically means is I'm going to see threats and challenges under my own lens versus somebody who's maybe the leadership team member over recruitment, or maybe you have a primary person who does scheduling and staffing. Depending on the size of your agency, you may have many individuals to involve, and even if you're a warrior of one, that's perfectly fine. You need to put on your different hats. So anybody which by the way, I lived it, a decade ago, started with a laptop, cell phone, and 2 caregivers, and now we've built this organization to this size through lots of great talent. But there was a day and time, and still to this day, where I have to put on different hats. But if your team of leaders is sometimes yourself or just a handful of people, make sure you look at things from every angle. And then the next step, obviously, is drafting a plan. You need to get one per each type of threat. So if there's a natural threat, there was a disaster, weather, something else, if there was a technology related outage, if there was a personnel, like what happens in a small agency or really any size agency, and let's say you have a director or somebody who's an administrator or the leadership over staffing, and they got the coronavirus and they were self-quarantined and they didn't feel well enough to be on the computer or the phone. That where are we going with this? So these are real implications that if you haven't even thought about that yet, but this is a point of concern. And then next, obviously distribute the plan. You want to share the compiled plans with as many leadership and key personnel that you can. I would recommend we use Google for everything, Google for work, Google Enterprise. And so we've got, Google Drive, Google Docs. These are living, breathing things where for some things we had planned for in disaster planning, other things we know are going to be effective and useful and we can pivot in some way. But having these plans drawn up, even in its rough form, are good. And then the last one is just to maintain the plans. If you change out technology, if you change out players, if your org chart changes, if your scope of services change, really needing to think through how is that impacted. I mean, in our example now, I can't just think about home care. I'm thinking about our transportation business. I'm thinking about our nutrition services. I'm thinking about the physical asset of 18, 19 locations in our company, many multiple departments. And the point is that it gets more complex. So it's complex already, even if you just had one office and a handful of clients and a handful of caregivers. It gets many times more complex. You need your team to be doing this with you. This is not something you do in a vacuum. And, we go back to this. Okay, well, I didn't plan. I would just tell you, don't be reactive. It's one of the most dangerous things that can happen right now from, in leadership, you don't have the luxury of being the average person. Doesn't matter if you're not the owner or anybody else. If you're in a home care agency and you're not a caregiver and you're listening to this, the reality is that at any position in the office, you are in leadership. You are managing other people. And you don't lead by, standing at the back of the room. You've got to take things front on. So to me, my definition of what is panic is somebody who is going and living and thriving off 100% on reaction, right? The people that, depending on the last news story they heard, is going to determine their attitude or mood. Depending on the last, it was 39, reported cases. Now it's 42. Oh my gosh, it's getting worse. There's rationale there. Certainly there's a need for concern. So I'm not one of those people that says, don't worry about this. I am one of those people that says, let's take this seriously. We should be concerned about it. But how do we deal with it? There's some facts that everybody just needs to absorb, and we have been as a team, which is to say, we think or we know that there's going to be many more people that are impacted by this and many that we don't know. In the entire state of Tennessee, as of 2 days ago, there was only 175 tests performed, period. And of those, then there were, people who had been identified. So as the tests start to roll out in the thousands and thousands on top of that, there will be more people that get identified. The number is going to rise. But, regardless of where you are in the stage, let's just say, yeah, you didn't think about this 5 years ago or a year ago or 6 months ago. You didn't plan. My only recommendation is you can start contingency planning on a rapid pace, really anytime. And now's a good time. If you're watching this, I hope that you'll back it up and take that slide deck and look at the contingency planning steps and try with your team and yourself to walk through that. And, a quote that's important is the best use of imagination is creativity, and the worst use of imagination is anxiety and panic. And, Deepak Chopra, I think the entire, mentality there is to say your mind is a powerful thing and it's all in how you're going to use it. If you're going to use it to go further into the negative, you can, and you will do a fantastic job of it. If you want to use it to get creative and get positive and try to figure out what to do and really solve a problem, you can, and you will do fantastic things with that. It's how you apply it, your energy and your time. I'm a big believer in that. Mindset is everything. It is very, very important. The next steps, I would say, is one of the core questions some people have had is, what are the next steps? What should we plan for beyond just the tactical things within your organization? People are really curious about I think not just my thoughts, but in general, the industry, the company, our economy and all of that. All I know is I can't control a lot of things, right? And my perspective is, if I can't control the things that are out there, I'm going to focus on the things that I actually can. And to me, my suggestion to you would be to use a 4-phased approach to just planning next steps. I want to give a big just disclosure here. For those of you who know me, I am not the kind of person that will dance around an issue. I hope you will not see this as in any level negative or inciting. I hope what you see or hear in the next little while here is going to be purely someone who wants to talk about things strategically and tactically about the realities. You cannot do contingency planning by pretending nothing's going to happen, right? You cannot do the needed steps of planning if you are going to say, well, certain topics are off limits, or we're just not going to say that the worst could happen. I think that everything's on the table. I think anything could happen. And in that way, I would say categorize it this way. And this is an escalating 4 steps. The first one is remote phase, right? And I think that's what a lot of us are facing right now, is that we're talking about getting functions within our business that can be, that can go outside of the physical location that we operate in. The next phase would be streamlining, and I think some of us are by force having to go to this level. Many of you, oddly enough, are already good at remote work. Some agencies who, like myself, started really small. We're used to basically in a 24/7 business. You got to figure out, how do I look at schedules at Saturday at 8 o'clock at night, right? Or how do I answer the phone at some other time? We are pretty well situated as an industry right now to be able to do some of the first step stuff. Streamlining is really, really getting focused on top line and the bottom line, right? Top line is revenue, bottom line is profit and the cash generated out of that. And we'll talk about all these in more detail in just a moment. There's phase 3, which that's a big step. You go into baseline survival phase. I think that's the stage at which we start talking about layoffs and cutbacks. It is something that I don't think we will get to. However, it's possible, right? We don't know how the evolving nature of government regulation, local regulations, and also just mass hysteria and panic is going to cause reactions in people. And then the last, I would say, is the sunset phase. And it's the dreaded shutdown, right? We're going to close the agency or company. This is really the one that this is worst case scenario. And I just, instead of worrying about it, it's kind of like, instead of me worrying about getting coronavirus next week, I'm going to act as if I was, right? And I'm going to figure out, well, what does that look like? What would I need to do? You also, it will protect you from thinking you're drowning in 2 inches of water. It's an overused little analogy that I have, but it's true, right? You may think you need to shut down and you don't. You also need to know the difference of, hey, wait a minute, am I in really phase 3, but I'm out of panic thinking I'm in phase 4 or not? So we'll talk about these a little bit more in depth. The remote phase, not much to say here. I would say prepare your staff to work from home. You figure out who has internet, who has laptops. How do your company phone lines work? Do you need to reroute things? Not having the 8 to 5 or 9 to 5, or in our case, like 8 a.m. to like 6 p.m. We've got staff still working here. Can we get to that same level of dedication in the home environment? That's going to take some conversation with your team. Evaluate the staff that may need to use their PTO or take a leave of absence. That I'm not saying make them do it right away, but you need to identify which ones will be asked to. You may have to, start thinking through some of that stuff. You need to evaluate some staff who may need to come to the office occasionally, right? There may be times in which there's some of you who still accept checks through the mail. This is a great time, by the way, to change that and get them on ACH and credit card. There's going to be some people who still receive timesheets physically in person. There may be others of you that still need to do hiring of caregivers during this time. So think about maybe skeleton crew and maybe some people who come to the office occasionally. And then identify what functions and tasks are going to be delayed a few weeks, right? If you had, we already know marketing activity, sales activity, some of that stuff is going to have to get creative. But there's also things that you can just put off for a little while, right? If maybe you had some new initiatives, maybe you had some community events that were going on. I think we all know this. This is a little bit of old news, but it's getting pretty popular just to kind of delay it a bit, and no one, luckily at this point, is holding it against you. You might think about minor cutbacks, right? A small reduction in force. It might be just one person. Who knows? The analogy I'll use here is that, just imagine we're in the situation we are, and we're presented with a patient who's got, not in actually non-medical home care, but in the analogy, in a war zone and other places where people have to triage is really where I'm getting at. There are times in which, in the remote phase, I would call it, it's the equivalent of, hey, we got to take your toe, right, before the infection and other things take place, but we're going to take a toe in order to save the patient. That's how I would equate this timeline here. The streamlining phase is probably the next phase for many of you. Some of you are probably already in it right now. Many of you were in it before anything even happened, because that's part of small business entrepreneurship and ownership and running it. We all feel like we're kind of in the streamlining phase. Really big focus on top line revenue and bottom line profit, right? And knowing the variables between the two. You got to figure out where you make money, and then also what things translate into money downstream at the very bottom. There's going to be people who protect your revenue, the ones that are getting more sales, the ones that are getting you new clients, getting new admits, or protecting that revenue, making sure clients are happy, making sure there's communication going on. And then there's going to be others that are focused on the bottom line of making sure there's no extra expenses, that we're getting cash collections, that people are making payments, and so on. So it's really operations focused, right? Sales and service, sales and service. You got to drive that one home if you're going to be in the streamlining phase. Your team and talent need to be kept on with the company, the ones that are there because they have direct relation to the top line or bottom line. This is not I hate to say it, but this is not the time for an unproductive receptionist, right? Or this is not the time for having, so-and-so, like the paid intern that doesn't really do anything, but we like them being in the office. But in the streamlining phase, you really start to cut out some of this extra. You may have to get as extreme as reducing some hours of office staff, like taking some hourly folks that are making 40 and cutting them to 30 hours a week. I'm not saying start with that, but this is something you may have to ramp up and progress, right? It's not like a stair step. It is more of a progressive line of where you're going to go. And, there'll probably be some layoffs here if this is prolonged and staying with the streamlining phase. In the analogy going on, this is more than a toe, right? This is one of those where we got to take a foot to save the patient. And I know this is graphic and I apologize, but this is how I equate it to my mind is in order to save the entire patient, the entire company, we may have to get a little more aggressive with our approach. Now, baseline survival phase is, this one is, in my eyes, a lot of you would say the fourth phase is the hardest. I actually think baseline survival phase is the hardest because you are truly trying to get down to the very absolute minimum to survive. So you're talking about critical functions only. You're putting off your expenses, and you're going to start making some phone calls to identify vendors who you're not going to pay. You know, you need to start calling American Express. You got to start calling the fuel card company. You may have to call the fleet services company if you have company cars. You might be calling, you know, your landlord and others, where you're really wanting to try to push out any money that's due out in order to protect the core, because you will get upside down at some point where just covering payroll for caregivers and yourself and a core team is going to be the priority. But ego aside, baseline survival, you do what you need to do. You know, your weekly payroll maybe needs to go to biweekly. Okay, if you get to this phase, you might need to stretch it out a little bit. You know, some people may need to go to payroll on the 1st and 15th. You may have to figure that one out. Biweekly billing, if you're still like monthly billing, biweekly billing, you might have to shorten that up, okay, to weekly billing. I'd say, once again, not a linear thing, but as you progress a little more, you might have to start billing daily, right? ACH and credit card, in order to protect cash flow, you might have to bill everything that happened yesterday, today. So you want to be thinking through that. This is survival, right? We don't get nitpicky or worrying about hurting feelings. We're truly in survival. This is why it's so hard, because communicating these things is going to be the greatest change. Negotiating any delayed rent payments, I think we talked about that. And then you might get into aggressive layoffs here. And this is the other part of making it really tough. And the analogy following it along, so we're past a toe, we're past a foot. This is like taking the whole leg off to save the patient. And for those of you, I don't take this lightly, by the way, if you've ever had a client or you know clients that are diabetic, you've seen that progress, right? That process of it went from small to big, big, big. And it's aggressive and it's really, really tough. It's life-changing type of scenarios. And then the last is a sunset phase where you really, you know, you're shutting it down. And this is a tough area to talk about, but the goal here is to conserve your capital. You know, you certainly don't want to lose it all. You don't want, you know, to get to a point your house is repoed, your cars are repoed, your, you know, any of those things. And I don't care what they say about the government's going to try to help, but I'm sure they will. But these things are real and you need to think about it. But conserving some capital, minimizing your losses. You want to do the sunset phase before you need to do it, okay? I can't say that, stress that enough. You want to be able, eyes wide open, have a really strong pulse on your organization. And I have to be honest with you, there's a lot of us, and I lived it for a long time, and honestly, every now and again, we experience that as our organization ourselves. We're in survival mode, you know, pretty quickly because of anything, caregiver shortages, 24/7 clients passing away, a major contract gets pulled, you know, you overhired in the office staff for talent, but we didn't see revenue growth. Nobody's immune from this stuff. This isn't about big agencies, small agencies. Everybody feels this stuff, but it will require from you as a leader to have composure, have some clarity, make sure you've got compassion during this entire time. Have decisiveness. You can't sit there and ride the fence. You're going to have to make some decisions, and it will be really tough. You know, and then patience. You need to not make it about your timeline. You're going to feel pressure, but you're going to have some patience in order to make things happen here. I do think some agencies may go through this. I think that many agencies will re-enter, you know, the space when the landscape changes, or they'll sell. You know, you may opt to partner and sell to others to make an exit. You know, and to kind of carry the analogy along is, you know, now that you've cut off the toe, you cut off the foot, you cut off the leg, you know, it may be time for someone else to help. And I say that with all kindness of just saying, there just comes a time where we're doing more harm than good. And in order to protect some of this, to make that happen. I don't think, you know, I'm fearful that people will become opportunistic in this. You know, we routinely, even before this was happening, we get calls from agencies, from many, you know, friends in the industry that will, you know, ask us to do a management contract, to come in and partner with them, or they want us to buy their agency. I will tell you that those kind of conversations will happen. I'm sure we as an organization, it's not our goal. Honestly, like just doing this video, the goal here is to help you through some of these things. I hope we all survive. I want to go back to the very first thing is contingency planning and doing these kind of being honest with ourselves as to what's the potential possible here. The goal is so that we have more clarity as we try to move forward through this. I am along the ride with every one of you to say, I hope we don't get past phase 1, right, or phase 2. I hope that this all kind of goes away, but it'll take some time. You know, now that we've brought it way down, it's been really negative. Is there opportunity? Yes. I want to kind of end it on a positive note. There's immense opportunity. Keep in mind that our clients are already isolated. Workers will want to work in the homes of people who are isolated. Yes, they're at risk, meaning our clients, but they are not the kind of people that will themselves be harboring coronavirus left and right. They don't go out in society. They don't go to public transit for the most part. And so for those people who are worried about, I mean, can you imagine if a facility was rumored to have corona, which they will, workers are going to feel uncomfortable, and they're going to realize that if this goes on for a few weeks and months, they're going to have some pressure to, make some other decisions. I think other service industries are laying off, which I'm very sad for them. I think about back in the recession days, our last recession anyway. But there were a lot of workers out there, and we can't solve everything, right? But what we can do is say we do have work available. Hopefully, as the demand continues to increase, we're going to have that. And then I think that there's a possibility that the public could lose comfort in congregate senior living. My mother owns an assisted living community. I've grown up in one, but I can certainly see where our corporate office actually functions out of the same assisted living. And I can see where that could be a challenge for families, right? They have their own fears, and so they may want to bring them home. I also think that providers with weak financial management will exit. So just purely from a competitive nature, I think the landscape could change. For companies that were already not paying taxes, or maybe they were cutting corners, maybe they were already not paying payroll on time, this will be a really tough time for them. And although it's not the future we all intend, I think we all know of at least a handful of providers in each of our markets that probably shouldn't be in business. And that's not to be mean. It's that for many of us who do the right things and we don't see the profits that others do at the end of the day, it's because we're taking care of business, right? We pay work comp and all the license and insurance and all that stuff, and others don't. I think former employees are going to want to come back if you offer them to come back. I think they're going to understand the pains for that. And I'm talking about caregivers that left 6 months ago. May come back to you now that their other job is like sent them home. But on the flip side, I think if you did have to go through one of the phases and you had to wind down just a little bit, I think there'll be resources for people who got laid off, and they'll have those resources for a minute, and then you as a company could hire them back when the time was right. And I hope it doesn't get to that point, but it's possible. And then the last part is, I know everybody's talking about children and daycare and that being a great challenge. I agree, it is. But I also think that people who need to work will find childcare alternatives. As somebody who personally grew up, without a lot of money, I had 2 working parents. At the age of like 9, I was home by myself. I'm not saying do that, but I'm just telling you, that it's people who got to work. They got to work. I stayed with a neighbor many days. I think you're going to still see that happening. There's no difference between this and summer when school's out. Yes, there's social isolation, so the kids can't go other places. But I'm telling you, as you know, many more caregivers than I do, that they find a way if there's a way. And then the last piece is, any predictions. I think it'll be a roller coaster. I can't stress that enough. I think that things will get worse, and then they'll get better, and then they'll get worse again, they'll get better again. I definitely think the strong and focused will be the most likely to survive. Um, Communication is going to be the driving force. In fact, the more you're talking to your clients and caregivers and staff is really important. You guys are getting a bunch of stuff, right? I'm getting emails from like somebody's email campaign from 5 years ago. I didn't even know they had my email still, and they have like a COVID-19 response. But it's good, and people need to be engaging with individuals as much as they can in order to help those independent home care owners that are getting this video. You know, we've got, I'm going to make available our kind of what our communication was to our clients and caregivers and social and so on and so forth. And if that helps you, I'm not saying copy and paste, but you know, if there's components of that that you'd like to use, please do. I mean, you know, it's we want our entire industry to survive this together. And people who operate through this will be stronger on the other side. I mean, you know, who doesn't like go through a troublesome time and doesn't feel more prepared and experienced at the end of this? There will be an end to all of this, and you know, people will come out the other side in different shapes and formats. But for those of us who continue to survive, the ones of us who make it through the other side, I'm telling you, we will be more prepared for the next challenges that come down the pike. And we will all have contingency plans, let me tell you that. I think businesses will adopt more mobile work options faster now. You know, now that we're kind of being forced to work from home, I think more and more will adopt that. I definitely see flu shots being mandatory this fall, whether it's internally with our agencies and companies or mandated by state and federal, or I think senior housing will just have so many requirements. I'm telling you, I'm kind of with bated breath over here of saying, I think there'll be a senior community somewhere, and they will have a COVID-19 outbreak. There will be mortality issues there, and the entire senior living and healthcare infrastructure will change its entire approach to infectious control and infectious disease control, and it's probably the right thing to do, to be honest. So I'm not even mad at them for it, but we're going to be very heightened. And then agencies at all levels will be criticized. You know, they're going to overreact in regulation. So I think CDC, I mean, look at all the like alphabet soup, right? CDC, Department of Health, you know, there'll be Medicaid agencies, CMS, you know, it'll go on and on and on. And then there'll be associations, and there'll be, you know, the Restaurant Owners Association, the Leisure and Hospitality Association. They'll all really push for regulation or protections going forward. It's the only thing I can predict, and it's the natural order of things. So to summarize, and thank you so much for all of your patience in this presentation, but you know, the Independent Home Care Alliance was really founded by myself and out of interest by a lot of other independent home care owners and operators, where we just wanted an opportunity to be able to connect and support each other in ways that maybe very large companies, you know, very large franchises, venture cap and private equity organizations, all of that, they have the benefit of, and we don't have the ability sometimes to organize in that same way. So if you're not a part of the Independent Home Care Alliance, you know, and you're an independent home care owner or operator, you know, please look us up on Facebook and join. We'd love to have you. And then for those of you who are part of the group, and it's a free group, there's no cost to it or anything else, you know, I would say look for resources. We are contemplating having a weekly scheduled, you know, kind of webinar type thing there for all of us in order to engage with each other. But, you know, if nothing else, make sure that this is also the purpose. I see such great communication coming from, you know, national organizations, the Home Care Association of America. I'm seeing state associations like the Tennessee Association of Home Care, you know, local groups, chambers, all of that. This is where we come together, and I would say keep the communication alive and going, and continue to support each other as we find our way really through this, and be encouraged. You know, we are the solution. I don't just say that we're Senior Solutions Home Care, but we as an industry are the solution. We are the ones that were already taking care of people that were isolated. We were already taking care of people that were out there. You got to stop comparing yourself to Old Navy, right? Or some restaurant. We are not a typical business. We're healthcare. We are a pivotal and critical part of the healthcare environment. And without us, nursing homes would be overloaded with people who don't belong there. Senior housing would be overloaded by people who don't belong there, and who don't want to be there. All of those institutions and areas have their own rightful place, but so do we. And imagine the number of people that you help every day. It is not only a passion and a calling. I truly believe it's a duty. And keep your head up. Be positive. Be the leader that you wish you had right now. You can be mad at all the politicians and government people that you want, but you got to act the way that you think leadership is then, and show that. It's a blessing to be alive today, and there's many people who are suffering and going through a lot with this virus. Our fear of it is not going to help, but our response to it can help each other. Thank you so much for taking a few minutes to listen to what I had to say, and I hope to engage with all of you. Everyone be well, and thank you so much.